These are Confessions of an Office Supply Junkie. I'm Joe Van Cleve, and today I want to talk about my addiction to fountain pens. Now, if you're already a fountain pen aficionado, I'm not going to really be telling you anything that you don't already know. This video is more geared toward newcomers to fountain pens, people who might know about fountain pens but have never tried them and wondered why use a fountain pen. Well, right up front, I'll tell you that your standard ballpoint pen is going to be more practical as a writing tool than a fountain pen. And why is that? Well, first of all, these generally don't have a risk of leaking, and so you're not afraid to carry them around in your clothing and in your man bag or purse or writing bag or whatever. Whereas fountain pens, well-made fountain pens generally don't leak, but there's always the risk of it because the ink is water-based, not oil-based. The other thing is fountain pens rely upon capillary action to write, and therefore the kind of paper that you're using has a lot to do with how well they write, whereas ballpoints are kind of more universal and they write better on most wider variety of papers. So right there you might think to yourself, well, why the hell do I want to use a fountain pen then if they're harder to write with? Well, that's a good question, but I think it's sort of like maybe an analogy would be, why drive a manual transmission car? Automatic transmission cars are easier to drive, but there's certain rewards to driving a manual transmission car that you don't get with an automatic. Why shoot manual film cameras when you can shoot a digital camera? Well, there's certain rewards to shooting manual film cameras that you don't experience with digital cameras. That's the kind of experience you get with a fountain pen. So why fountain pens? They have a certain style, a certain elegance. They have a certain cost factor to them that makes them appear to be a little bit more valuable. They have certain writing performance, and there is a tweakability or customization ability of fountain pens. There's various types of ways to fill the ink up using bottled inks, and so that implies that there's a lot of kind of gadgetry and other accessories with fountain pens. It's kind of cool. One of the attractions to fountain pens for users and collectors is that there's a certain history to fountain pens. I think in the history of writing technology, you had dip pens, quill pens, and then sometime in the 19th century, the fountain pen came along. And for a large part of the first half of the 20th century, let's say World War II and prior, fountain pens were the primary writing tool. And then the ballpoint came out after World War II, and that kind of changed the entire writing technology. But fountain pens have a certain history to them, therefore, and there's kind of a legacy to them that people appreciate. And I think also there's a cost factor. Fountain pens appear to have higher value, and so that attracts a certain kind of person. For myself, I'm really attracted to fountain pens by their writing quality. There's certain things about the way they work and the way they write that I really enjoy. I'm attracted to that much more than merely their looks or style or appearance of expensiveness. Because, for instance, in this collection of 5 fountain pens, the 2 that I use, or the 3 that I like the best for writing, are plastic pens, the Twizzbee, the Lamy, and the Pelican. The other 2 that are metal, they are more elegant, they're heavier, but I don't like as much to write with. So for me, it's really more about writing quality. Well, let's talk about a basic fountain pen. This is an X pen. It's a kind of a Asian-made fountain pen it's fairly heavy body, inexpensive. The pen cap pulls off, and you post the cap on the back of the pen to write, to give you good weight balance. The way these pens work is you unscrew the body of the pen from the nib assembly, and you will have a ink cartridge. This is kind of the universal standard size ink cartridges. And the cartridge will come, when it's full, it'll come with a little plastic end cap that's in place, and there is a sharp little metal protrusion in the feed assembly that when you stick the cartridge in and push it in, it's going to pop the little cap. In fact, you can see there's a little ball bearing, actually, a little plastic bead that keeps the ink stirred up. But anyway, it pushes the cap in, boom, when you push it onto that metal tube inside. And then it's able to feed the ink up to the nib. Now, the way these fountain pen nibs work is it's two metal tines that have a ball, half ball on each end, and there's a tiny little split between them, and the width of that split and the alignment of those two tines is very critical to how well the pen writes. They have to be very even, uniform. The gap in there can't be too wide or too narrow, and the tines can't be crooked like that in order for it to write well. But basically the way the fountain pen works is it's capillary action, and you're simply resting the ball tip on the paper, and the surface tension of the liquid pulls the liquid out of the nib onto the paper. So the thing with a fountain pen is there's very little pressure required to write with. You're not pressing with your hand, so it makes it much more relaxing for your hand. Now, these standard cartridge type fountain pens, you're going to be carrying a pack of cartridges around with you. When you run out of ink, you pull the old one out, throw it away, and you buy a new one. I did that for years with cartridges, and then I kind of got tired of having to worry about, well, do I have another cartridge available? Now, some of the pens like this one, there's room in the back of the body for a second cartridge, so you can carry a second one around with you. But what I've been doing more recently is I've been getting into bottled inks. Now, here's the thing about bottled inks. With cartridges, you only have a small selection of ink colors and brands of ink that come in the same style cartridge. You may be aware, or maybe not, but there are different size and types of cartridges for different brands of ink. This is a Schaefer fountain pen style. This is more of the universal style. There's a cross pen style. There's the Mont Blanc style. There are the Lamy Safari style cartridges, etc., etc. So you have to have the right style cartridge to match the model of your pen, and you can't really get fountain pen cartridges at the big box retail stores except the universal kind and maybe the cross kind. You have to go to a specialty fountain pen store or buy them online. So that gets to the point of, besides cartridges, there is two other ways of filling up your pen, and let's talk about that. So besides cartridge refill, what you can do is, like, for instance, this is an inexpensive pen that are really nice to use. This is a Lamy Safari. They come in a wide variety of colors. I'm going to pull the cap off and post it. So they have a little window in there on these, which is kind of nice. You can judge the amount of ink you have left, but I'm going to unscrew the body of the pen and set it aside. Now, what this is called a converter cartridge. So it looks very similar to the standard disposable type cartridge, except it has a little knob on the back, and there's a little piston, and you can screw the knob and it will push the ink up. And what you're doing with this is you push the piston all the way up, and then let me reach around behind here, and then you're going to use bottled fountain pen ink, and you're going to dip the tip of this down into the liquid ink until the surface of the ink is on this cap, and then you're going to screw the piston back, and it will suck the ink up into the cartridge and fill it up. Now, sometimes people you'll have a little bit of air up here. It won't fill it completely, and what people like to do is turn it upside down, push the air out, which will be a little messy, and then fill it up a second time to get as much as possible in there. But this is basically called a converter cartridge, and a lot of different pens, you can convert them from disposable cartridges to bottled refill by using a converter. But keep in mind, not every pen uses a converter. And the reason why is some of these pens don't have enough room in the back of the body to use the converter, because the converters are extra long because of this knob you have to turn, and the stem of the piston, see, it has to extend. When you pull it back, the stem of the piston has to go out here. So you have to have enough room in the body of the pen to use a converter. So not every pen can use a converter, and you have to get a converter fit for your pin style. So in the Lamis, the style of the nib assembly uses these little slots, like tulip slots, and there's a set of wide slots and there's a set of narrow slots. The converter has two little bumps on it. Those two little bumps have to go into the narrow slots and click in place. So this converter is built for a Lamy Safari. So Lamy Safaris, you can use converters. A lot of other fountain pens you can also. So the other way to use a converter, by the way, besides pulling the converter out and sticking the end of the converter in the bottled ink, is simply to put the nib with the converter already attached in. You immerse the nib up to the before it gets to the plastic, just the nib part itself, and then you pull up, retract the piston and let it suck up the ink into the cartridge. That's usually the way I use a converter itself, because if you're doing this method, you're going to have ink on the end of the outside of the cartridge, and you jam it up into the body and you're going to get ink up inside here. And then the thing with fountain pens is there's a certain amount of maintenance required. You're going to have to consider the possibility of cleaning them every so often, pulling them out when they go empty, pull them out, flush out the insides with distilled water and dry them good, and then refill them with ink. So then the other kind of piston fill pens we'll talk about, a little bit more expensive than the Lamy Safari. So the Lamy Safaris retail, they run about $35 maybe, $30 to $35 depending on where you buy them. There's also other Lamy pens that use the same system, but they're a little more expensive, more fancier body styles. But for an inexpensive pen, these are pretty good. But you get up in the higher end, you get into the Pelican pens. These are made in Germany. Again, they have a wide variety of kind of body styles. This is a plastic body style. They have heavier ones. The thing about this, and it's hard to see this on camera, but this is like the whole body of the pen is a converter. There is a piston assembly, and the piston right now is way up here, and this is the front of the piston. And you basically twist the cap. Let's see if I can go with it. You have to know which way it goes. Okay, you twist it, looking at the end, you twist it clockwise, and it draws the piston up to pull the ink into the body. So this does not use cartridges at all. This is strictly a piston fill pen, and the way you fill it up is you're going to push the piston down toward the end of the body, toward the nib, and then you immerse it into your bottle of ink and draw the piston back up. So it fills up the body of the pen with ink. And the nice thing about these is that it gives you a lot more ink capacity compared to one disposable cartridge. The maybe potential downside is that you have to consider the possibility of carrying bottled ink with you if you're going on an extended trip like a vacation or something where you want to be able to write in your journal for a while. So a load of ink will last longer with a piston fill pen than it will with most converter or standard cartridges, but you have to think about having bottled ink. Now this X pen that I showed you earlier that I'm using the disposable cartridges on, this pen is too short to use a converter. So I have to use disposable cartridges. And you might have that kind of a fountain pen where you can't use a converter, which means you can't use bottled ink. Well, what do you do then? What if you want to use bottled ink, but the pen just doesn't, it's not long enough to have a converter? Well, one of the things you can do is you can go to the hobby shops and you can buy this kind of a little disposable plastic dispenser. It has a tiny little capillary kind of tube on the end, and you basically squeeze the bulb and you can suck up ink from a bottle. And what you do is you take one of your empty ink cartridges for your pen, and the tip of this applicator will go right inside here. So what you're actually going to do is you can carry your bottled ink and you can refill the disposable cartridges from these little syringe type squeeze bulb applicators. Keep in mind that these aren't really designed to be reused, so the plastic hole, or the hole in the plastic end where it mates up with the little metal tube inside the tip, if that hole starts to get worn out through repeated use of pulling it in and out, it'll start to leak. So you might want to consider using these several times and then throw them out and then use another one, right? Because you're going to have these disposable cartridges anyways from using the pen. So that's another option, right? Is you can refill the disposable cartridges with bottled ink and a little syringe bulb applicator thing. Now, the latest fountain pen that I started using a lot, and I really love it, this is called a Twizzbee, and it's made by a company in Taiwan. And the thing I love about it, so first of all, it's a piston fill pen, quite a bit like the Lamy or the Pelicans, but it has a clear plastic body to it, so you can see the mechanism and you can see the ink in it. Now, I'm using Parker Quink Blue Black, which is in this bottle here, and that's my favorite fountain pen ink. I love the blue-black color of ink. And the way this works, obviously being a piston fill, is you turn the back ring, the back knob. Now there's a little locking ring you can unlock here. This little chrome ring is a locking ring, and then you can turn it, and then you can lock it back so the knob doesn't turn. So you dip it in there and you refill it. Sometimes it can get what happens with bottled ink is when the ink in the bottle gets down toward the bottom, you'll find that there's not enough height to fill the pin up because you have this nib here and you need to immerse most of the nib. You need to immerse it, I would say, above the wide point, up above like about here. But if you don't have enough ink in the bottle, what do you do then? Well, sometimes you can kind of tilt the bottle, but then you're going to end up probably getting ink on your hands when you touch the rim of the bottle. So one of the things that Twizzbee came up with is they have this ink refill bottle. So what you do is you pour your ink into this bottle, and the bottle has a conical shaped plastic interior secondary container, and it has holes up near the top. And what you do is you tightly put the cap on tight, then you turn the bottle upside down and tip it back, and it fills the interior conical plastic thing up with ink. And then you take the cap off and you can dip the pen into that inner conical reservoir, and it has plenty of height, plenty of volume to fill your pen up. And so it's kind of designed for refilling those pens. Now they also give you a secondary cap, and this kind of a cap is for another model of Twizzbee fountain pen that you can unscrew the nib and then you can attach the end of the piston into this fitting and literally suck the ink up into the pen from this dip tube. So there's two different ways of filling it up based on which model of Twizzbee you get. But I love the Twizzbees because of the clear style. When you post the cap, it's nice and long, so you get a nice weight balance. I just like the looks of it. It's sort of that mechanical, transparent look that appeals to me. But this is a great pen. Okay, just like in ballpoint pens, fountain pens, the tips come in a variety of sizes, and there's two basic sizing systems. There's a German sizing system or European, and there's a Japanese or an Asian sizing system, and they're measured from fine, medium, wide, extra fine, extra wide. But just know that the Asian sizing systems are a little smaller than the European ones. So a medium in Japanese is going to be narrower than a medium for a German nib. The other thing about nibs is that you have the less expensive nibs are steel or some kind of a steel alloy. The more expensive nibs are going to be some kind of a gold alloy. Now, which ones are better? It really depends on the individual nib. You can't universally say that gold is better than the steel kind of alloys. Generally speaking, a lot of people like the flexibility of a nib. When you press the nib down on paper, they want to see, some people like to have that variation in line width based on the pressure of the pen. But keep in mind that fountain pens, you really shouldn't have to put a lot of pressure on to write. So the most important thing for me is about how easy it writes, whether it skips or not. And really the quality of the writing is important for me more than the quality or the gold appearance of the nib. Now, another thing about fountain pen nibs you'll find is that they sometimes won't write perfectly to suit your hand. And you'll find sometimes when you first buy one that you have to break the nib in by doing a lot of writing on a fairly rough paper. Because what's happening is there's going to be a little bit of wear on the tip of the ball tip where the ball splits, and you have a little split in it for the capillary action. That has to kind of get worn down to your particular hand, which is the angle that you're holding the nib to the paper and the kind of the pressure and motion. So there's going to be a little wear spot it has to build up in order for it to kind of start to get broken in for your particular hand. There's also a difference between right-handed and left-handed people. If I take my fountain pen that has been well broken in for a right-handed person and I let a left-handed person use this pen, it might not write very well for them. The other thing now it gets to is how to use a fountain pen. First of all, you never want to push toward the direction of the nib. You want to pull back and sideways. You don't want to put a lot of pressure on the pen, on the nib, because it'll split the tines apart and it could ruin the nib. This happened to me with somebody in my family whom I bought a fountain pen for, who was used to writing with ballpoint pens and applying lots of pressure because of cheap ballpoint pens, and they immediately applied a lot of pressure and they ruined the nib. It was a nice $100 pen, and I had to go buy a new nib off the internet. But you don't want to put a lot of pressure on a fountain pen. They don't need pressure. They go by capillary action. But know that out on the internet there are videos about how to fix fountain pen nibs, and it has to do with realigning the tips so they're even and they're not crooked, and so the gap is proper. So there's a little bit of maintenance on these fountain pens and how to take care of them good. I mentioned earlier about collecting pens, and I don't have a huge collection. I have 5 or 6 pens, but I know some people have dozens or if not hundreds. But at least they're smaller and easier to store than typewriters. But so the thing about fountain pens is I buy them to use them. They're a tool to write with. I'm not so interested in classic looking fountain pens from the early 20th century or mid 20th century. Other people collect fountain pens because they like the history of them. I like the modern fountain pens because they write real well and they're inexpensive usually. And that's what I'm attracted to. But for you, you might be liking the old Parkers or the old classic, pens of the World War II era, and that's fine also. Now let's talk about one of the biggest issues with fountain pen users, which is compatibility between the pen, the ink, and the paper. Because you have an availability of a wide variety of different models and colors of fountain pen ink with bottled inks, and a wide variety of different kinds of papers and different notebook journals and loose paper and etc., and a lot of different kinds of fountain pen nibs, you'll find that there is a wide variety of performance differences between different combinations of pen, ink, and paper. And you'll find some combinations work better than others, and you'll have to, as a fountain pen user, find what works best for you. The biggest problem I find is the paper. There are some kinds of papers that simply don't work well for fountain pens, and there are 2 issues with them, 2 or 3 issues. So this is a brand of notebook I really love. This is Field Notes. They're great notebooks, but this is just a little test I did with the Twizzbee and the Parker Blue Black ink. And there's a little bit of bleeding. The ink feathers or spreads on the paper. So that's the first issue, is feathering or spreading. The paper is a little too fibrous, and the watery ink wants to spread out too much. This kind of paper is really ideally suited to ballpoint pen ink, which is more oil-based rather than water-based. It's thicker and it doesn't spread as much. So for fountain pen use, this paper isn't really ideal. The second problem is show-through, or on the back of the paper. You can see it shows through, so that's another issue, right, on the fountain pens. Now, conversely, where's my little sample? Here it is. I have a certain type of paper that I use for typing on. It's Mead general purpose paper, and it's actually used to be Mead typing paper that they've rebranded. So it's typing paper, and I make these little neat notebooks that I keep in my wallet. But I just did a little test on the Mead typing paper, and this word testing down here, and it doesn't bleed. like on the field notes paper. I don't know if I can get these two in camera next to each other. Maybe, maybe not. Let's see here. So this is the field notes, and there's a little bleeding, and this is the typing paper. The meat typing paper doesn't do any bleeding. And then as far as show through on the back, it's actually right here, and there's no show through. It doesn't bleed through the paper. So this Mead typing paper is thin paper. It's thinner than printer paper or copy paper, but it doesn't bleed through. You'll find for using fountain pens that certain kinds of notebooks work better than others, certain kinds of paper. And like if you like Moleskine notebooks, you'll notice that maybe some kinds of them, the paper works fine, other kinds they don't. You're going to have to experiment with that. But the paper, the ink, interaction, that's the thing about fountain pens. You can't just write on any kind of paper. Now for me, because I'm a pragmatist, I'm into fountain pens to use them as tools. So what's important for me is cost versus performance. Let's talk about that a minute. These three fountain pens are the three that I tend to use most often. And as far as cost goes, I would say the Lamy Safari is the least expensive. They come in about $30 to $35 range. They have a steel nib. The next one in cost is going to be the Twizzbee. I don't remember what they are, $50 maybe or something like that. Again, they're piston fill, whereas the Lamy is cartridge fill, but they will take converters. And again, I think the nib on the Twizzbee is some kind of a steel nib, but they're both pretty nice. The Lamy and the Twizzbee are both pretty nice. And then the third, this is a Pelican, and it's like an M100, and it's a German nib, and it's a piston fill. But the the Pelicans start at about $80 maybe on the internet, and if you buy them from a local pen store, you're going to end up paying more than $100. And there's a whole series of M's. There's M200, M300, whatever. It goes up to hundreds and hundreds of dollars. But as far as writing quality, I find all three of these pens are very equivalent. I would say the Lamy is a slightly scratchier, harder nib, but it's fine. People love them, and I love them for the cost. And I find the Twizzbee is every bit as good as a Pelican for a lot less money, and it holds a lot more ink, I think. So for me, the important thing about pens is the nib versus the cost of the pen. So the quality of the nib, how it writes, and then what kind of fill system is most important to me. If you're into the style of fountain pens, you like beautiful mother of pearl and gold plated and all this stuff that costs hundreds of dollars, that's fine for you. That's not why I like fountain pens. But for me, they're practical tools, and for me, the cost to performance ratio is important. So these kind of pens I like for that reason. Okay, let's talk bottled inks. Bottled inks is a whole nother subject. You can obsess over bottled inks. There is a wide variety of colors available now. There is every color you can imagine in bottled inks. Green, purple, red, orange, and aquamarine, and all this stuff. A lot of different brands also. My favorite general purpose writing ink is going to be Parker Quink Blue Black. I just love the blue black color. Now this here is Private Reserve, and it's I can't read backwards, the Velvet Black. It's a really dark, inky, nice dark black. So for blue and black ink, these two inks I like. I get both of these from my local pen store, Pen and Pad in Albuquerque, but you can mail order this stuff off the internet, a lot of different types. I think one of these days I'm going to try buying some red ink, because when I'm writing, rough draft writing in my journal books, or my, loose sheets of Staples sugarcane pulp paper that I like to write with, I like to redline edit my writings, and I currently use a ballpoint pen, but maybe I might get some red ink and fill up one of my other fountain pens. So that's the thing about bottled inks. It's a whole other world to collect and to obsess over. As I mentioned earlier, the kind of paper you're using is really important to the quality of your fountain pen writing experience. Some papers simply work better than others. What I found for an inexpensive paper is this Staples brand eco-friendly paper. It comes in these legal pads, and it uses the sugarcane pulp or bagasse paper, recycled paper, and it's great for fountain pens. It's a little bit thinner and crisper than standard type legal pad paper, but it works really well. Staples, Bagasse, sugar cane pulp paper. And also, by the way, I write only for me to understand it, usually, which is why I like typewriters. My handwriting is terrible. But this particular paper works really well with fountain pen. The ink glides across it. It does not bleed or feather at all, and the ink does not bleed through the back side of the paper. So you need to find the kind of paper that really works well for fountain pens that you like. Again, if you're using little notebooks, pocket notebooks, these field notes, they're great books, but the ink does bleed. Some of the Moleskine books work well, some don't. I don't know if I have a Moleskine up here that I can try. Let's try one, shall we? This is unplanned. This is totally unplanned, but I have these two books, and let's try just giving it a test here. This is more of the 5x7 kind of style. Testing. Twizzbee plus Parker Quink. Okay, so let's look at bleeding first of all. There's not too bad. The ink is definitely, it makes a wetter line, a fatter line on this paper than it does on the sugarcane pulp paper, which is, it's a little bit drier on the sugarcane pulp paper. So it's a little bit wetter. I would say, like on this E of Parker, it's slightly bleeding, but not too bad. Let's see how the show through or the bleed through on the back side. There is a little bit. You can see the really wet letters. There is a little bit of bleed through. So I would say, at least for this particular type of Moleskine, the 3 ruled journals, it's moderate. It's an okay paper, but it's not great. There is some bleed through on the back side. But you'll have to investigate the kind of paper that you like to use. Let's try another one here real quick. Now this is the Write in the Rain notebook. I don't even remember how well these work. This is sort of water resistant paper. It may not work at all with fountain pens, so we'll see how bad this is. So this is, oh, not bad, not good at all. Okay, you see that? It is like hydrophobic. The paper is hydrophobic. It won't even take a watery ink. So if you're using Write in the Rain notebooks, they're great for ballpoints, but don't use them for fountain pens, okay? So you're going to have to, oh yeah, here, one more thing, Rhodias. Rhodias are French made, and let's try a Rhodia pad, shall we? This is the grid paper. Oh. Twizzbee plus Parker Quink. This is nice. This has a real smooth feel to it. And it's a dry, it looks very much like the sugarcane pulp paper. The letters don't get real wet and wide. And it's smooth and no bleed through. So I would say for notebooks, I would recommend the Rhodia pads are really good for fountain pens. For loose paper that you can tear out and file, 3-ring hole punch and file, I like the sugarcane pulp paper, the Bagasse paper from Staples. I have nowhere near exhausted the subject of fountain pens. I've only touched the surface of them. There's a whole world of fountain pens out there. There are internet discussion forums, fountain pen discussion forums. There are websites that sell fountain pens that do videos and blogs every week about fountain pens and stuff. So if you are interested in fountain pens and would like to start using them, I would encourage you to try them out. Buy yourself an inexpensive pen like a Twizzbee or a Lamy Safari. Just get some cartridges. It's for the Lamy to start with until you really decide if you like fountain pens or not. But fountain pens are special. They write special. They're smooth. They're a gadget. If you're a gadget kind of guy, you like to tweak and figure things out, what works best for you, they're really fun for that. If you're just wanting a pen, use a ballpoint, right? Thing about fountain pens, you don't want to loan them out to people that don't know how to write with them. There's a lot of people in this world that seem to think that fountain pens are disposable, like toilet paper. They're going to take your pen and not give it back. But to be honest with you, a fountain pen is a special instrument, and I wouldn't loan it out to everybody. So this is Joe Van Cleve. I'm an office supply junkie. Have a great day.